Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the slightly delayed virtual book launch for The Pattern. I'm afraid we've had a few technical issues. Andrew Bamford, our series editor, was meant to be presenting, but I've had to jump in as well and take over, as he's had a few issues with his net connection. So my name is Rob Griffith. I'm an editor working on the series along with Andrew. I actually edited Robbie's excellent book. And it was a real pleasure to work on. As we are running a little bit behind now, I think we might as well jump straight in. As Robbie goes through and tells you about the book and some things he found during the research, please type your questions into the chat on the right, and at the end of the session, we will answer as many of those as possible. So I shall now leave the stage to Robbie.
Yes, I have one question before leaving the stage.
Yeah.
Just double check. I'm getting the slide up. Just want to make sure everyone can see it. Is that functioning?
Yeah. So you should have a button down the bottom. In fact, can you see it now? I can see it now.
Yeah. Can you? Is it up? Can everyone see the slides?
Right. Well.
Can you see the slides, Rob?
Yeah. Yes, we can see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll leave it to you, Robbie. Okay.
We're good with the slides. Hello, everyone. Hello. Sorry for the delay. Technical issues. It's not a web talk without technical issues. So here we are. So yes, this is the virtual launch for The Pattern, which is a regimental history of the 33rd Regiment Foot during the American Revolution. So I've rather grandly titled this little chat Writing a Regimental History, which I guess is what I did. I suppose that was what I set out to do. There were some caveats. When I was trying to decide what to talk about tonight, the first instinct was, well, I should just talk about the contents of the book. But I realized that would probably become a bit heavy pretty quickly if I was just saying, and then in 1776, the 33rd did this, and then in 1777, the 33rd did this, and people would turn off quite quickly. And also, if you want to know about that, that's why you buy the book. So that's the nitty-gritty of it. For the actual chat for the next half an hour, 40 minutes, I thought I would discuss how I went about writing it, why I went about writing it, some of the positives and the negatives involved in writing it, kind of pulling back the curtain a bit, looking behind the scenes a little bit, at one went on with writing it, and I thought people might get a bit more out of that than just a staid description of what you'll get if you buy it, if you haven't already. So yes, I'm talking about writing a regimental history. Let's see if the slides really work by going on to the first one. It does. So why is the first question. Why write this book? There's a few answers to that. One of the first ones that comes to mind is that when I was a teenager, I think I was 15, I read Mark Urban's excellent book Fusiliers, which is all about one British regiment during the American Revolution, the 23rd Foot, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and I really loved it. It had a big impact on me. I wouldn't say growing up because I was 15, so I was a bit growing up already. I was already very into history and all that sort of stuff. Vaguely interested in the American Revolution, wanted to learn more about it, bought this book, read it, devoured it, because it's very readable. It's not sort of heavy academic stuff. It is very well sourced. You know, it is a real history book, but it's crafted in such a way that it's very readable, very engaging. It's almost got a story-like quality to it, which I just adored, and cemented my love of history, cemented my love of the American Revolution, my interest in it, which I went on to study at university. So that is a regimental history. It's one of the very few existing ones that we have for either side during the American Revolution. Surprisingly, the Continental Army and the British Army both don't really have huge numbers of case studies for specific units, which is fairly unusual, I would say, on the British side of things, because if you know the British Army, you know that it's very structured around the regiment. The regimental tradition, regimental histories are quite popular in terms of how you tell the story of a conflict. We do have other ones, and more so recently. So Paul Knight's A Very Fine Regiment, also published by Helion. It's about 47th Foot, and that does a great job of telling their story during the Revolution and beforehand as well. And you should get it if you haven't already. And we have a few other sort of similar works. I don't think offhand that there are other ones from the past 30 or 40 years that deal with a specific British regiment during the American Revolution. We do have a lot of regimental histories that cover the history of various regiments throughout multiple wars, even multiple centuries. And obviously, if said regiment was involved in the Revolution, then they touch on the Revolution and their contribution. But by necessity, those bigger works are less focused. So we don't tend to learn as much as you might like to learn if you're studying the Revolution and you really want to know what this particular unit did during the Revolutionary War. So I wanted to provide something for a regiment in the British Army that really focused on just the Revolutionary War and told the story of what they did, sort of like what you might think of as a combat history, which I don't really want to get into the semantics of a regimental history versus a combat history, but they're much more familiar to people who research basically any conflict from World War I to the more modern periods, because we have a lot more sources for those wars, and they tend to really focus in on the unit's engagement and granular level stuff. So a lot of eyewitness accounts and even stuff like combat diaries, which I don't think it's a common practice in the British Army, but certainly other nationalities, like say the Russians in World War II, for example, would have a formal combat diary regimental history, which scholars can then use to create regimental histories. So we don't have that, but I wanted to try and get as close to that as possible in this period in the Revolution, which wasn't easy, but we'll get onto that. Why the 33rd is another why question. The basic answer is that they fought a lot of battles. So ideally that could do the heavy lifting in terms of content if they're involved in a lot of engagements. Not to say that there isn't a lot of interesting stuff that happens to units that aren't involved in a lot of battles. And I think what I learned to appreciate when I was writing this was just how interesting the non-combat stuff is. But from a basic selling point and a basic sort of catch, draw someone in, having a lot of battles is quite good. So the 33rd had a lot. I've never actually counted up the total amount of engagements, but certainly they were involved in everything apart from the very beginning. So Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, all the major actions after that had a 33rd present, even Saratoga, which the regiment technically was not at. But again, that would be getting too into the details of the book, so you'll have to find out more to read that. So yeah, that's some of the answers as to why. All of that came together, and I just decided that the 33rd was a story that needed to be told. And the next thing after I focused in on having them as the main subject matter was establishing how viable it was as a project. So what were the sources? It's more difficult for this period because there are less sources for specific regiments, specific units. You can build up a good amount of sources if you want to spread out your coverage and look at what different officers and different regiments were saying about specific events. You can more or less cover things, but having stuff that's focused solely on the activities of one regiment is a bit more limiting. So establishing that there were sufficient sources for the project was basically the first goal, and in doing so, you can see here this lovely reenactment photo. The 33rd Foot's modern antecedents in terms of reenactments, at least in the UK, were very important for this because they'd already done a lot of the groundwork. So I had been thinking about writing a history of the regiment prior to discovering the existence of the reenactment group, but it all fell into place, and I realized that it was something I really wanted to push to do. When I actually contacted the group and became a member of the group, I almost considered dressing up for this, but I thought that might be pushing it a bit too far. But yeah, so various members of the 33rd Reenactment Group had already done a lot of research because they wanted to attain the highest level of accuracy possible for their own impressions, for the group itself. But that in turn formed the basis of a lot of the research that I was then able to expand upon a bit for the writing of the book. So it was kind of a synthesis approach. I can probably talk a bit later on, if people want me to, about the melding of academia, reenactments, popular history, stuff like that. But again, I don't know if that's a bit off topic for this. So I shall forge ahead for now, and I'm very happy to talk about that later on if people would like, if there's time. So some of the best groundwork that was done by the group was the fact that they had collated the muster rolls and the inspection returns for the 33rd in the years just prior to the revolution. So the British Army is quite good at keeping these particular records. It's not so good at a very low level in terms of the documentation of recruits, and aspects concerning them is not as thoroughly detailed as it is in, say, the French military of this period. But in terms of the regimental level, or the battalion level, often interchangeable, they keep records for this. There's yearly inspections for every regiment in the British Army. These are formal events that will decide if the regiment is up to scratch, if they are sufficiently trained, if they are properly equipped as per regulation, and basically if they are fit for service, which is the phrase used if they are considered adequate for serving overseas. So the inspections, the yearly inspections, were extremely important, and they were documented. And they provide us with a wealth of information about each regiment, all sorts of stuff. So clothing is an obvious one, if they're up to standard, but also if they're doing anything a bit different or anything that isn't regulation, their drill and their general deportment. Even little notes like with the 33rd, for example, they note that they seem quite short overall on average in terms of height, and quite young, a bit younger than the average expected age of soldiers during the period, which is maybe a bit sweeping in terms of the inspecting officer merely observing them as opposed to having hard data. But then that plays out in the hard data we have, which accompanies these sorts of reports. So it's really valuable. We've got things like average height, average age, the specific details of officers are included, so when they received their commissions and how long they served in each rank, and all of that is a real data goldmine. So you can extrapolate it to an extent. It's not absolutely perfect. So things like the height, for example, they give you all the soldiers who are of certain heights, but then below, I think it's 5'2", they stop telling you how tall people are. It's just a blanket. There are, say, 36 soldiers in this regiment that are under 5'2". What height those soldiers are, we don't know. So frustratingly, it's technically impossible to form an exact, this was the average height of the regiment, because there's 36 guys that are shorter than 5'2". We just don't know how short. So in the terms of that, clearly they weren't thinking about future historians and wanting very nice specific graphs and tables showing ages and heights and things like that. But it's still a good level of details that they provide us with. So had that via Gary Ashby in the reenactment group, which really made me go and sit up and say, oh, there's stuff here. And every regiment in the army has that for this period. Sadly, I think there's one year where the records for the 33rd were lost. I think it's 1773, 72 or 73. So we don't have that. But there's one for every year leading up to the revolution: 1770, 71, 73, 4, and then 5. So when I read that, I thought, hey, you can use this. This is the raw data, the raw material you need to build up a picture of how the regiment looks, literally and in terms of statistically. Also the work of Mark Lodge, who is a former officer in the modern antecedents of the 33rd, the Yorkshire Regiment in the British Army. He has a great interest in the regiment during the American Revolution, and he wrote a dissertation about the peacetime service of the 33rd just prior to the Revolutionary War, and trying to establish to what extent the regiment was exceptional in terms of its training, its drill, its uniforms, things like that. That's another very interesting topic, and again, it was tempting to make that the subject of this talk. Are the 33rd an exceptional regiment, or are they just quite good but not the best? But again, I think you're going to have to read the book to find out more about that, because I didn't want to get carried away and discuss that as well. But Mark Lodge wrote his dissertation about the regiment and covered a lot of really interesting stuff, as well as the data I've talked about. He tracked the marching orders of the regiment, so we know exactly where they were and how they were divided up throughout the British Isles in the years prior to the revolution, and used that to explain some instances of why he thinks the regiment was exceptionally well trained. For example, they're not often split apart when they're garrisoning Britain. They're not often divided into different regions. They're generally able to stay in two halves, and because of that, they're able to train frequently together in two halves. And that maybe explains why they do very well at these inspections, which happen each year and generally get glowing reports. Anyway, this is me getting sidetracked. So he very kindly provided his dissertation to me, which again had a wealth of data in it, and that built up my belief that there's something to this. This project has legs, potentially. But the data is all well and good, but it's still not much use if we don't have sources, primary sources that cover what the regiment was doing in the Revolutionary War. And for this, I really felt that we needed to be able to see the conflict from, if you like, above and below stairs. So officers' accounts, but also, if possible, the accounts of enlisted men, which would go a long way towards this almost like combat diary idea that I had going on. And for that, I was lucky because the 33rd did have an enlisted man who provided a very detailed account of, of his service, and by extension, a good chunk of what the regiment as a whole were doing in North America. So he was called John Robert Shaw. He was from Yorkshire, as were a lot of the 33rd. And he later in life wrote down his memoirs, which did quite well apparently in terms of sales in America. He lived in America after the war. Why is, well, it would be a spoiler if I told you, I suppose. But he wrote about his life, but a good chunk of that was his experience during the American Revolution. So that's, again, really valuable source for me. There are very few enlisted men's accounts of the revolution that cover a good deal of time. I'm not sure the exact number. There's a few dozen, I think, enlisted men. The most famous one is Roger Land, who for most of the war is, the whole war, I think, is an NCO, corporal and a sergeant. And he leaves a very famous account that features a lot in Mark Urban's book Fusiliers, because he served in the 23rd for about half the war. So that's one of the famous ones, but in general, there are very few and far between. So the fact that there is one for the 33rd, and I could represent the viewpoint of the otherwise sort of never talked about enlisted men beyond the facts and figures of how tall they were and how old they were and things like that, that was very valuable. And I'm glad to say as well that Shaw has more or less a very good memory. So obviously you have to take memoirs with a pinch of salt, because at the very best it's written years after the event, and there's other factors that play in, like why are they writing it and what's their target audience and are they tweaking things. And I think there is some tweaking that goes on in there. But in terms of things like Shaw remembers the names of the captain that enlisted him, for example, and the corporal that drilled him. And when I first read it, I thought, it's probably just misremembering, or maybe these people didn't even exist. But no, if you go into the Chelsea Pension Archives or the muster rolls for the officers, they're there. So Captain Kerr is the man that enlists him, and then the corporal, Coggle, is recorded as having served decades and decades in the army, and that backs up his claim, Shaw's claim, that Coggle was the best at drill and sort of one of the best NCOs that a man could have. And the fact that he's doing that while presumably he didn't have access to any of these records when he was living in America, he very much cut ties with the British Army. I'll just say he deserved it. And the fact that he remembers these accurately is a good indication for me as a starting point. And I'm able to double check, compare and contrast what he's talking about and make sure that the stuff is accurate, which it more or less is. So sadly, there isn't much for enlisted men beyond him, but the fact that he even exists in the first place is a bit of a godsend. In terms of the officers, that's often an easier job because, understandably, officers write more letters and diaries and occasionally post-war accounts. And there are a few that the 33rd have access to. So scattered stuff like there's the Grenadier officer, the Grenadier Captain Hildebrand Oakes has a few letters in existence that we know of. They've gone up for auction, but they were very kindly provided to me by Don Haggist, who I've not yet mentioned, but who also contributed a great deal in terms of the source work and the material. He's just the master of the subject when it comes to the British Army during this period. So he provided me with copies of Hildebrand Oakes' letters. There's another officer called Duke, who there's just one letter, and he talks about the Battle of Brandywine. So these are good for building up a sort of a patchwork view of the regiment, but there's one officer in particular, Captain William Danzy, who commands the light company for much of the war, but goes on to command the entire regiment after Yorktown, what's left of it. And he, thankfully, is a very prolific writer. He sends a lot of letters home, mostly to his fiancée or his mother. And it's just fascinating stuff because he talks about everything from a tent he's designed to how he hasn't taken his clothes off for a month because he's campaigning so hard he hasn't had a chance to, have a wash or anything. And again, really sort of captivating accounts of day-to-day life during the Revolution. But he's a 33rd officer, so we get to see the regiment through his eyes. It's tweaked a bit because he serves because he's the captain of the light company, he serves in a light battalion for a good chunk of the war. So he's away with the light battalion, he's not serving with the 33rd, but still, obviously I don't want to not tell the stories of the 33rd Light and Grenadier companies just because they're detached, they're still part of the 33rd. So Danzy does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of source work for the officers and things like that. You also get mentions of the regiment in other accounts, again, normally officers. So John Peebles is the Grenadier Captain of the 42nd Regiment for much of the war. He mentions in his very comprehensive diary, he mentions the 33rd a few times. Kemble, a loyalist officer, keeps a very comprehensive diary. He mentions the 33rd a few times. So even though these officers aren't part of the 33rd, you can mine their work for mentions. And again, if you bring all of these sources together, then you can kind of create a quilt, if you like, of descriptions and detail about what the regiment was doing and what it was experiencing during the war. A shout out to Duke of Wellington's Regiment Museum because they provided me with scans of the Danzy letters. There's a lot of them, but it's great because it's exactly the sort of material that is required to write the book. And that was via the Delaware Historical Society. They are the holders of the actual Danzy letters, along with the flag he captured. Sadly, it wasn't as exciting a story as it might sound. It was in someone's baggage, and he captured the wagon, and it had the flag in it, and it was only militia. But anyway, sidetracked again. But yeah, both of those museums were very, very helpful in providing the Danzy materials, which form a lot of the basis, along with Shaw, for understanding what the actual regiment was doing during the war. So I've said why I wrote it. I've said the sources that form the foundation for it. The next thing I had to cover was the nitty-gritty of putting it together. And I quickly decided that I didn't just want to tell the story of the 33rd by rote. As I said at the start, it would be a bit bland if it was, this is everything that happened in 1777, and then this is everything that happened in 78, and it just carries and rolls on like that. So I decided I wanted to branch out a bit in terms of the things that the regiment were experiencing and use them as a vehicle to talk about broader topics. So I tried to cover as much as possible, things like everything from diet to disease to the role of women camp followers to what it was like to sail on a voyage from Britain or Ireland to North America. These sorts of things, because obviously the 33rd experiences all of it, but you don't necessarily see that appearing much in the sources. When it does, it's only quite brief. So Shaw, for example, might talk briefly about what he ate one day, and then I use that opportunity to then say, more broadly speaking, this is the sort of things that soldiers were reading on campaign during the Revolution in the British Army, or this was how disease impacted them. That kind of thing, because I didn't want the reader to have to feel like they were extremely well read on British Army, American Revolution historiography to get the maximum out of this book. So you wouldn't have to go away and read social histories and things like that. I mean, you should, because that's the real stuff. I'm just lifting from it. But I want the reader to be able to experience as much as possible while following the 33rd throughout their journey, and not, if I had a passing comment about them having dinner, then you wouldn't have to go and find a different book and say, well, what was it they were eating a lot of the times? It's normally salt, meat, and biscuits, but anyway. So yeah, hopefully I was able to use them to extrapolate what was happening to the wider army to an extent, and synthesize that a bit and bring it out as much as possible. A narrative element. So this maybe is a bit of a holdover from my day job, which is making stuff up, which I'm not allowed to do when I'm doing things like this book. But as I'm a novelist, fiction for the most part, so sci-fi and fantasy, not historical fiction yet, maybe one day, hopefully. But I include into the idea that you want to engage the reader, you want to tell a story. So despite the fact that this is not a story in a fictional sense, I still wanted it to be engaging, and to do that I tried to bring out the characters involved, in this case very real characters, from Cornwallis, who for the most part is too busy leading entire armies, if not just sections, brigades, divisions during the war, to write a whole lot about what the 33rd are actually getting up to, right down to people like Shaw and other enlisted men or NCOs. So I wanted to use them as to draw the reader on, essentially, so it doesn't just become this bland retelling of battle after battle after battle, or marches or things like that. Whether that worked or not is really, I don't know, it's up to you, but hopefully I did it in such a way that it was engaging without feeling like I was ever embellishing things. There's the temptation, I think, that all popular history writers feel, to go a bit further than they should and say things like, when I was doing my PhD, just as a brief example, we would have a round table every week where the PhD candidates and their supervisors would discuss the latest work that the candidates, us, had been doing. And I remember one of the candidates was hung out to dry a bit because she was writing an account, and she started it off with describing the morning of the day in question as being quite cold, and her supervisor said, well, but do you know it was cold? Because you're kind of just making that up. If you have it in a diary or something like that, a meteorological report, anything, then fair enough. And she admitted, well, no, it just sounded good. It was engaging. It's a narrative technique, and that's not on, because you can't just do that, sadly, in history. But the temptation is always there. So I tried to fight that as much as possible as a novelist, to keep it to the facts. Where we do know about certain things, sticking with the theme of weather, we know that the Battle of Monmouth, for example, was sweltering heat. So I do talk about how it was very hot and probably very sweaty, but hopefully without laboring the point too much and making it seem more made up than it is. So it should be all completely grounded. Part of that narrative was telling the story year by year. Because I just felt that was the best way to cover everything. I could have jumped around, but that didn't really seem to make much point. The danger in doing that was that it would become a bit labored, but hopefully the setting up the figures like Danzy and Shaw as kind of characters in this ongoing story draws the reader through it. They want to find out what happens to them. They want to find out what happens to the regiment year on year. The secondary literature, that's my current view to my left right now. Those books, there are more, don't worry, it wasn't just them. But the secondary literature was very important, because I realized, to my horror, after getting about a third of the way through, that what I was actually doing was writing an entire history of the American Revolution, because the 33rd was so involved in every major battle after the first year of the war, that to tell their story, I had to literally cover the entire conflict all the way through, right up to, it's ridiculous, they almost fired the last shots in 1783 in a skirmish around New York. So to do that, I had to be able to delve into the secondary literature about the individual incidents that they go through, and thankfully there's a lot of really good stuff out there. So talking about Monmouth already, Fateful Sunday is just one of the best, I think, battle histories that you'll read about the American Revolution. It specifically covers Monmouth and the campaigns surrounding it, but it's just so good, and it clues me in terms of what I should be mentioning, what I should leave out and say, well, if you want to know about how Monmouth went as a whole, go and read that book for starters, because this remains focused in on the 33rd quite specifically. So when I tell the story of the Battle of Monmouth, obviously I touch on the fact that there's a larger battle going on here, but it's more or less just what the 33rd do in that engagement. It just happens to be right at the end of it. So they appear at the end and save the Grenadiers again. So I would urge anyone that reads the book, although I've said earlier, I want to talk about wider issues that affect the army, things like diet and disease and things like that. If you want to know more about the specific battles and things outside of the 33rd, then there's a bibliography of the book is hopefully quite comprehensive. So get stuck into that. But yes, that was the idea in terms of the format and the layout. There's me very sweaty at my first ever reenactment. Yeah, what does the book hope to achieve? Hopefully it gets as close as we can get to a combat history of one unit during the Revolutionary War. Thinking about it now that I finished it, I'd be fascinated to try and do it with a different regiment, as though I've not suffered enough. No, it was very enjoyable. With a different regiment, again, it would all be about the sources initially and how much I could square away, you know, how viable it is as a project. But hopefully I've brought together some of the older work about the British Army and combined it with some of the newer things like Don Haggist's Noble Volunteers. It's just an amazing book. It's, I would say, probably the best book about the British Army in the American Revolution. And that's the sort of thing that covers a broad gamut of regiments and their experiences and the experiences of ordinary soldiers and soldiering life during the Revolutionary War. But hopefully I've drawn from topics like that. Sylvia Frey is British Soldiers American Revolution, I think, or just the British Soldier in the American Revolutionary War. She does a lot of statistical work, so looking at things like disease and how it affected combat effectiveness of the army, or diet and how it impacted campaigns a lot more than we might imagine, because when you read military history books, they don't tend to talk about what soldiers are eating. They'd much rather talk about what they were shooting at, things like that. So trying to synthesize all of these aspects and cram it all into one book and tell the story just of this one regiment, which hopefully I've done. Hopefully it's a bit more of a personal story. I try and emphasize that at the end because I think a lot of regimental histories traditionally, especially the older ones, they will talk about what became of the regiment afterwards as though it's some sort of big monolith, some inhuman creation that we can talk about without talking about individuals. And I try to steer away from that by having the closing sections of the conclusion talking about the actual fates of the individuals in the regiment, from Cornwallis down to Shaw and Danzy and various other characters that get mentioned throughout it. So my hope is that that's endearing and that it puts a human face on the conflict, which is sometimes tricky to do because it's so far away from where we are now in the world that it's sometimes difficult to put ourselves in their shoes. But hopefully I've helped do that. That's all I've got on terms of slides. I can keep talking, but I'm not sure how I've done for time. That's 40 minutes. Not sure if I meant to speak for an hour and then ask for questions, or meant to speak for 40 minutes and ask for 20 minutes of questions. But yeah, I'm very happy to talk about absolutely anything whatsoever now, assuming it relates to the American Revolution within reason.
Thank you, Robbie. That was excellent. Right, we have two questions. Firstly, from James. What was your favourite 33rd anecdote that you discovered when researching the book?
Thank you, James. probably something to do with Shaw, because he gets up to some crazy antics. Well, this is one of those stories that I feel like it's a timeless military tale. So Shaw he's an enlisted man, he's a private soldier in the 33rd, and he talks about how he gets into a fight with a member of his mess group. So there's, I think it's 6 soldiers organized into a mess group, and they cook and eat together, and that's just the organizational basis for a regiment in the British Army. So he falls out with one of the guys that he spends all his time with in the army, and they get into a bit of a scrap. I think he's a butcher originally, so apparently I'm imagining he's a big guy. And Shaw's sergeant comes up to Shaw and says, I'm not resolving this, it's up to you to resolve this, and to resolve it you have to fight him, which is kind of the opposite of, if you don't come from a military background or you don't understand the military, you think this is not good man management, literally telling him to fight someone else. It's the opposite of discipline, having soldiers fighting each other. But he says you fight him and you beat him, and after that it's done. No matter who wins, that's it, over. And Shaw says, I did fight him and I did beat him. I gave him an Irishman's coat of arms, which I think is 18th century slang for a bloody face. And he said that after that we were forever friends. So it worked. And I feel like that story you could pluck from just about any military in any period of history, including modern day, and say, yeah, I get it.
Okay, a question from Matthew. How do you find writing fiction compared to writing non-fiction?
It's obviously very different. I enjoy both. I tend to juggle them. And I guess I've actually had quite a bit of experience in it, because although this is my first full work of non-fiction, I started doing the fiction work when I was doing my PhD still. So I would have a system then when I would do about 2 or 3 months on and off between them. So I'd do 2 or 3 months for a novel, 2 or 3 months PhD, 2 or 3 months fiction. And that kept things fresh for both. So if I was just doing one, I guess it would get pretty stale. But they both have positives and negatives associated with them. Strangely, if I do fiction for a long time, I find it quite nice to do non-fiction, because there's something in my head which says, well, it's kind of already there, because it's sources and it's history. It exists. You don't have to make it up. Just go, read about it, and then collate it and write about it. That's quite easy. And now I get sick of that and say, oh, well, novel work, I can make it up. I don't have to worry about sources. I can just all pretend. So there's freedom, weirdly, a sense of freedom in doing both, and it's nice to be able to juggle them. I guess I was fairly, I wouldn't say tired of doing the non-fiction stuff by the time I finished this book, but it had been about 2 years at that point, still on and off, but about 2 years since starting it. So I was quite glad to finish it. Do I want to dive into more non-fiction yet? I don't know. I think it's getting there. I'm looking at these history books here. I'm thinking, yeah, I'd like to write stuff about that. So, yeah.
Okay, a question from Mark. He's interested to know if you came across any evidence that desertion rates significantly decreased as the outcome of the war became more obvious and morale presumably dropped.
Offhand answer is no. Desertion rates are interesting in general, I find. I don't think the 33rd desertion rates were notably different from any other regiment during the war, but the caveat is that desertion rates fluctuate a great deal depending on where the regiment is and what it's doing. So if the regiment is sort of in an isolated area and not doing much, then desertion could be pretty high. If the regiment is in the middle of British-controlled territory, say on New York, Long Island, it's very difficult to actually get away from there if you decide to desert and make it to rebel lines. So desertion rates are generally a bit lower. In terms of desertion rates going up when the British realized that they had probably lost the war, it's difficult to say when the British realized they'd probably lost the war, because Danzig, for example, is talking about how things were completely hopeless in 1777. So I think, in a sense, there's realization that things are not going well very early on. So whether that plays into desertion in general, I'm not sure. Desertion after Yorktown, for example, I think is quite high. It's sometimes tricky to see when people desert and when they get captured. You know, if they've actually been captured, if they're deserting on purpose and getting caught on purpose. Shaw is an example of that. I said I wouldn't talk about him, but I guess I will say I've already mentioned he deserted. In his memoirs, he says that he went off into the countryside to get some food because he was starving, and oh no, some rebel dragoons turned up and captured him. And then he decided while he was in captivity to switch sides. Whether that's true or whether he's just saying that so he doesn't look bad and he actually decided to leg it and intended to never come back is impossible to say. So there's that grey area that makes it difficult to talk about with absolute certainty. But I don't feel as though desertion was hugely rampant towards the end of the war, except in specific cases. Saratoga is another good example. So the prisoners of Saratoga, I think there's only about a quarter of them left in captivity by the end of the war because they've deserted in so much as they've escaped from captivity, but also not gone back to the army. A lot of them do also go back to the army. There's crazy stories of soldiers deserting and making their way back. The 33rd has a sort of great escape moment where I think about 6 of their NCOs do a runner after Yorktown. And sadly, we don't know anything about it, apart from the fact that Danzy says that he's really glad that these 6 NCOs have all come back as a group because they can now take charge of the new recruits that are filling up the numbers that were lost at Yorktown. But I can't imagine what they went through, some crazy antics, which sadly we'll never know, but historical fiction, that's what that exists for.
So, Marcus is asking, what is your favourite or most annoying myth of the era?
Of the era, the whole era.
Most annoying myth. I'm presuming he means the American.
Yeah. A lot of the stuff to do with the British Army being incredibly incompetent. I think that's being very effectively put to bed by a lot of works these days. You know, there's a lot of material coming out about the army during the revolution and talking about how it actually did adapt very well to the conflict, and you know, the idea that the British had never fought in forests before and things like that is just wholly inaccurate. I feel like that's being dealt with so well now by so many different authors and even sort of non-academics, people on YouTube and stuff, producing great content that's just smashing that overarching myth. I feel like we need to focus on smaller myths. I don't even know, probably wigs. The idea that soldiers all wore wigs constantly in combat. Wigs weren't completely done away with, but it wasn't a British thing. For some reason, there's this concept that because the British were all dandies, they all had powdered wigs, and the rough Americans, the rebels, were all sort of close-cropped hair, or at the very least didn't have powdered wigs. Ironically, one Continental Army general was very insistent about having his men have powdered white hair. Anthony Wayne, Mad Anthony Wayne, I think I'm right in saying that he made sure that his troops all had their hair cued and powdered before they attacked at Stony Point, which went on to be one of their most famous victories. So we actually had the Americans going into combat with fancy hair.
Okay, so next question. Gary is asking, on the whole, do you consider under Cornwallis, the 33rd were in all but name trained as a light infantry?
Yes, that's a very interesting topic. And like I said at the start, I could have easily done this talk about that. I decided not to because it is dealt with quite thoroughly in the book. But in general, yeah, one of the most interesting things about the 33rd is that they are basically operating as light infantry, which is, as a concept, it became popular in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, so prior to the Revolution by about 15 years. And it then came back for the Revolution because senior British officers realised that light infantry were ideal for North America, fighting in woodlands over difficult terrain, fighting in loose order. And the 33rd were trained by Cornwallis prior to the Revolution in these sorts of tactics. He didn't train them in light infantry tactics because he knew there was going to be a war in North America, but it was becoming quite popular at the time. The concept of light infantry tactics was growing as a doctrine, military doctrine, and Cornwallis wanted to be at the cutting edge of the military. So he drilled the 33rd quite extensively as an entire regiment of light infantry. During the period, one company out of the regiment's 10 companies would be a light infantry company, but Cornwallis wanted everyone in the regiment to be more or less conversant with light tactics, so skirmishing in woods and things like that. And we see from the inspection returns I mentioned that he succeeds in this, and the 33rd actually then train other regiments in light infantry tactics because they're so conversant in it. The extent that they get to operate in North America as light infantry is more open to debate, just because we don't have the sources there, not too many sources anyway. It seems that they phase in and out of being used as light infantry depending on the overall commander and depending on the campaign and the operation that they're involved in. So we have a letter from Clinton's headquarters in 1779 that reports that the 33rd have requested to operate as an entire battalion of light infantry, presumably for that campaign period, and the request has been granted. So we know they are performing like light infantry. And that again is repeated in the south in a year later in 1780, where there's another report. A German Hessen Jaeger officer talks about how the 33rd are one of the regiments that have been assigned to the Army's vanguards because they are to operate like light infantry. And this leads to a rather, I wouldn't say amusing because people die, but strange incident where other regiments are jealous of the 33rd operating as light infantry because it's quite a prestigious thing to be able to do, and they demand the chance to operate as light infantry as well. And they do this, and they do it badly because they clearly haven't been properly trained in it, and they get ambushed and lose a bunch of men and get rescued by the Jaegers. So the 33rd seemingly were competent in this style of warfare, and they certainly acted as light infantry for large chunks of the Revolutionary War.
Okay, Matthew, another question from Matthew. He's asking, or says, it's often tempting to think of people from the past as being just like us. What would you say are the biggest differences in terms of beliefs, views, outlook between soldiers in the 33rd then and civilians of the period and modern soldiers and civilians?
That's a good question, because, yeah, it can go either way. We like to flatter ourselves that people are just like us, people who laugh at similar jokes, and, the experience of life is not that different, no matter what point in history you decide to pick to study. And yet, it's so difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of someone whose world view, whose entire life is just also extremely different to what most of us understand. I think I'm struck by, when I read a lot of Danzy's letters and things, I am struck by the humanity and the shared commonality that we might have. His concerns about, he has a servant called Ben. We think he's a boy because we probably wouldn't refer to him as just Ben. We'd probably give him a more formal name or Mr. or something like that if he was grown up. But he has a servant that he takes on campaign with him in America, and this poor servant suffers all sorts of tribulations alongside Danzy. He gets shot at and he suffers from disease, and Danzy frequently mentions him in his letters and reports how he's doing, if he's sick or whatever. And he doesn't just say that to the person he's writing to, so either his fiance or his mother, but he asks his mother to pass on that information because she knows Ben's parents. Presumably all come from the same area where Danzy is from. So he's passing on that because he knows that the parents won't have the means of communicating with him, and he wants them to know basically frequently that he's fine. I think he survives the war. We're not sure. He kind of disappears out of the letters, but I think it would have been mentioned if something terrible had happened to him. So really humanizing things like that make me lean towards the fact that there's a clear connection there between the way we are today and the way they were then. But at the same time, it's so difficult to make sweeping statements because a lot of life was quite brutal. I'm not fond of the idea that history was terrible and people in the past lived terrible lives because they didn't really know any better. So it wasn't for them to say that I haven't had a shower today because no one's having a shower today, not every day. So it's not like they missed it. But things could be pretty brutal back then. Accounts of injuries sustained during fighting, or Shaw gives a very dark and detailed account of his first experience in combat, which he sort of no holds barred describing the people's intestines getting ripped out and horrible stuff like that, which really brings home the realities of it.
Okay, last question from the audience. Chris is asking, do you have any thoughts on why the average age and height were lower than other regiments?
Interesting. Not really. The 33rd is a bit unusual in so much as they were very localized on Yorkshire. So at the end of the war in 1782, the army institutes the idea that regiments will be based in specific locales within Britain, which was already a thing, but it wasn't formal. So regiments were known to recruit from certain areas. They were already associated with that area. But in 1782, it often becomes part of the regiment's title. So the 33rd become the West Riding Regiment, so they're specifically tied to Yorkshire. But they already have a lot of recruits from Yorkshire. They're associated with Yorkshire. I think the sample I use in the book from about 60 recruits, half of them are from Yorkshire. Just Yorkshire, not England, but Yorkshire. So clearly the regiment was known about in Yorkshire, and they used that as part of their recruiting method. Maybe the regiment was seen as a more youthful regiment. Cornwallis certainly wanted to push the idea that they were going places, that they were at the leading edge of developing things like light infantry tactics. I don't know if that would have attracted a slightly more youthful subset. In terms of the heights, I don't think you can really say, it's not like short people are going, that's the short regiment, I'm going to join the 3rd. I guess that's just a quirk. It's interesting to see that it is a real thing in terms of, it's not just the officer having a glance and saying, they're looking short. It is actually spelled out in the return, which gives the heights of different soldiers, but it's not a huge difference. I was talking an inch or maybe 2. So no, I'm not sure why those specific demographics exist beyond the fact that they do draw from one area, maybe.
Yeah, I think later in the 19th century there were differences in regiments which recruited from cities versus the country, but that would be too early in the Industrial Revolution.
That is very interesting, because we do see the start of the Industrial Revolution in this period, and a lot of recruitment is based on the collapse of certain industries like weaving. So there's a lot of weavers go on to become soldiers. So maybe weaving is a short profession, I don't know.
Okay, I've got a quick question for you. Did joining the Patton Living History Group help in the writing at all, or did you have to be careful not to equate what you were experiencing with what the soldiers at the time?
Yes, well, I mean, it certainly helps from the most basic point of view that a lot of the research was already done for me. Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. That was really important, because literally throughout the whole thing, not only was there source work already provided, but I could bounce ideas off people, and I provided early drafts to people to check out and see what they thought of it. And it was really a team effort, and genuinely not gilding it when I say that it probably wouldn't have been written if it wasn't for the reenactment group themselves. In terms of sort of transposing my experience as a reenactor onto what I was writing, I don't think there was much danger of that, mainly because I only managed to fit in 2 reenactments while I was actually writing the book. And this was the first time I'd ever done reenacting, so it wasn't as though I had a great deal of experience in that field. I think it's very valuable in terms of trying to get a bit of a handle on experiences. Things like the uniform, for example, it's another myth. It's often derided as far too formal to be, fighting a war in a heavy woolen red jacket, and it must be too heavy and cumbersome and hot. And I discovered from personal experience that isn't really the case. Once you break them in, after literally just one day of running around in it, it will mold to your fit, because they're each tailored, they're hand tailored, including our reenactment kit. All hand tailored, and so it fits really well. And actually, it's not much of an encumbrance. After one day of wearing it, I wasn't really conscious of sort of things like the weight, things like that. You just don't think about it. So in that basic one, it helps a great deal. But I wouldn't, obviously, I'd never try and imply that I had even a slight inkling of what soldiers went through in the 18th century, because I'm not even a proper hardcore reenactor. I don't even sleep in the tent at night. I go to a hotel, so I'm a terrible person. Yeah, I'm terrible. But no, I think as a hobby, it's extremely valuable for these sorts of little things, like the uniform, like the experience of things like seeing in a in a skirmish how gunpowder seriously reduces visibility. I went to the big 200th anniversary for Waterloo as a spectator, sadly not as a reenactor. That was a huge event. It was about 8,000 people involved, and it makes you realise that after about half an hour, you could barely see a thing because the smoke from it. You read about it, but to then actually experience it and see how that would have impacted battlefield conditions, I think that is valuable. But at the same time, no, I can't claim that I truly understand the nature of being a soldier in the 18th century just because I run around in an extremely well-made uniform.
I know some of the guys who do the AWI 33rd also do Napoleonic 33rd. Were there any chats around the campfire about the differences or the similarities over the 30 odd years?
Not that I've experienced, but again, I'm very much a newcomer to all of this, and I'm not in the Napoleonic 33rd. I do love sort of comparing and contrasting the uniform and seeing things like my partner is envious because she much prefers the sort of grey-blue latter Peninsular War / Waterloo trousers that they have over the breeches that we have. But thankfully, the Revolutionary War 33rd have just taken their assignment of gaitered trousers, which are very similar to the later ones, which I think are going to be much easier than having to worry about breeches and stockings and garter straps and gaiters and things like that. So these little things are quite fun to observe. And it is interesting as well that there were soldiers in the real 33rd during the Napoleonic War who served in the American Revolution. So very long-serving NCOs. There were still a few that saw service. I mean, the 33rd weren't actually greatly involved in the Peninsular War, for example. They were in India for a good chunk of it, I think. But obviously they were at Waterloo, things like that. So there are veterans who would have experienced the American Revolution and the Napoleonic periods, and I wish they'd left more accounts because that would have been fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we're back up on our hour, so we need to call it a day. In the chat, I put a discount code for the book for those of you who've not bought it yet. Please do so. It's an excellent book. Just reminds me to say thank you very much, Robbie, and I look forward to reading the next book.
Get cracking. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.